Let's be honest, board game ratings, especially on BGG, just lack nuance. When somebody rates a game, they're not just asking themselves if it's good or not, they're thinking through all of the different categories that are important to them in board gaming and aggregating all of that into one number that should signal to the entire world, is this game good or not? Sure, if there's a review in there, you can read it and it gives you some context, but usually not enough. And the vast majority of those ratings have no context whatsoever. In a world where these two ratings can be posted within hours of each other for the best game in the world, according to BGG, you know there has to be something broken. Those at least have some color, but like I said, many lack context completely. Sure, the law of averages should take care of that and aggregate to an average rating or ranking that you can use as a guide. But the flip side of that coin is it's also diluting perspectives from people that might look a lot like you in their board game preferences. In result, we get an average rating that doesn't represent who you are as a board gamer and whether you would like it or not. In fact, I would imagine there's a ton of games out there that your avatar would find exhilarating, but they're never going to have the critical mass to throw them to the top of your algorithm or even to the top 100 on BGG. In general, you tend to agree, or at least the 100 or so people that took my poll, where 60% of you think that BGG's top rankings don't really represent whether a game is good or not. So with this newfound confidence in my premise, at least 60% of you confirm that for me, I'm going to investigate my hypothesis a little bit further. I'm first setting out to figure out what makes a good game. And to do so, I read a book, I chat with GPT, and I pull the crap out of you, and now I have a hypothesis. So strap in, grab some popcorn, and let's change the way we look at board game ratings. So my first inclination is to ask why I play board games, and the very first thing that comes to mind is the word fun. So let's define it, and let's see if that encompasses why I play board games. What provides amusement and enjoyment? I don't think that quite encompasses why I play board games. I think it's much more complex. However, that is part of it. So let's investigate that further. The good news is we have Ralph Koster, who has written a book on that exact subject, A Theory of Fun, as it relates to games, not just board games, but also video games. It is a great read. I highly recommend you to read it if that's something that interests you. In The Theory of Fun, Ralph Koster argues that fun in games comes from learning and mastering new skills. Games are enjoyable because they present patterns and challenges that the brain finds interesting to decode and solve. In fact, our brains love to devour patterns, and it just so happens that games are a tasty pattern morsel that they especially love. The problem with patterns, though, is they get extremely complicated. In fact, if you look deep enough with static on your television, there is an algorithm there. There is a decodable pattern. But with board games, if they become complicated enough to the point where you see static when you look at the rules or try to understand a teach, you're highly likely to either rate it very badly or flip the table and quit and walk away. Finding fun in games is about challenging our brain to the edge of its ability, really trying to take a player just to their limits where the challenge is just within their grasp and not too far where they get completely frustrated. And when you find that spot, you achieve flow state. And that flow state, I think we've all probably been there. For me, it almost feels like my brain is firing off in all these different directions. It's really exciting. I start to see all of these different possibilities and strategies to go after. I don't know where to start. I'm excited about solving that puzzle. In fact, when my wife and I first played Ark Nova, it was very much this experience. It was a new game, so it took extra long. It was probably 2.5 hours for the two of us to play. But by the end of it, we looked up at the clock and we could not believe how much time went by. It felt like 30 minutes, yet our brains were completely focused on the task at hand. One of those factors of finding just the edge of your ability is the number of dimensions that your brain can comprehend. And, you know, some of this is intelligence, but it's also learned. Over time, you play enough games, you can add more and more dimensions to your game and be able to comprehend and solve that puzzle. Take tic-tac-toe, for example. When you're first learning tic-tac-toe, you're really thinking about 2 dimensions. You want your symbols to be in a row, and in the second dimension, you want to predict what the other player is going to do. Then you understand how to do it, and it's a cat's game every single time. Checkers adds to the dimensions, going from 9 to 32 spaces, and also it's adding another dimension in the player piece is moving. So you play that for enough time, and then you move on to something like chess, which expands the board even further and adds variable player powers or variable piece powers. If you were to have given that 5-year-old chess Unless they were a member of Mensa, they would be completely lost. However, tic-tac-toe is just the right number of dimensions for them right now to be able to play the game and have to figure out the puzzle. That feeling that they're getting is probably a lot like a 15-year-old that's learning chess for the first time who has mastered tic-tac-toe and checkers, and both of which have become boring. The overarching point here is when a player is assessing whether they like it or not, you don't know what their experience is. Have they even learned tic-tac-toe yet when they're trying to give you a review on chess? So after getting through the book and boiling down that fun is a very important part, but that's related more to kind of the puzzle and mechanics of the game, I knew there had to be more. So of course I had to go consult a friend, the one in which that writes all of my board game reviews in ChatGPT. And I asked a pretty simple question. Other than fun, why do people play games? And being the smarty pants GPT is, they gave me a long list, which includes psychological benefits, social interaction, cognitive stimulation, emotional engagement, and physical benefits. But then I was left with, how do we rate on all of those categories? So I asked GPT to boil it down to important categories that are rateable within the context of board game, many of which I've already had on my list in mechanics, theme, replayability, complexity, social interaction, aesthetics, but there were 3 that I hadn't really thought about: challenge, luck versus skill, and player engagement. Challenge sounds a lot like this idea of skill gap. How much practice or continuous plays in this case does it take to become proficient at a game? And then there's luck versus skill. That, along with challenge, kind of has the same problem where I don't think inherently one side is better than the other, so it's hard to rate on that. Now, do you want a player's opinion on, is it more luck versus skill, or is the skill gap really high, meaning I have to play a lot to master or become proficient in the game? Yes, I think that information is completely valuable, but maybe not part of our rating system. And then there's player engagement. I think this is a really important category. However, I don't know how to rate on it, right? I don't think inherently it's good or bad. In fact, I polled you all on this and over 60% would prefer player interaction. However, there is a significant group that prefers multiplayer solitaire. So that kind of falls into the same category as the previous 2. It's really good to know and something you want to take into account. It's almost a yes/no qualifier. It's just not something that can be rated as good or bad. Now that we have some categories, I have to rate the games. And clearly all of these categories should not have the same weight on our decision. And I think that weighting is probably subjective. So this is what I came up with. Mechanics and flow are the most important to me in 25 and 20% respectively. The reason being that those are the things I have to have for a game to work for me. I can make concessions on almost any of those other categories, but if I'm to be engaged enough to be able to play this again, I have to really enjoy the mechanics I'm playing. I have to be engaged by them, and preferably I find myself in that flow state where time passes by and I'm not sitting there feeling like I'm grinding a game to the end. And rules overhead is pretty important, and this is not one that we really had talked about, but I relate this to accessibility, both for myself and other people I'm playing the game with. If there's a lot of rules overhead, I'm not going to want to have to relearn a game each and every time, and I'm going to have a hard time teaching it to people, and it's just not going to hit the table. So what good is the brilliance of a game if you can't play it? And I hate to say it, but something like Voidfall falls into that category where the rules overhead is pretty intense. And I went through a significant period where I played it all the time, but the idea of getting that back out and playing it right now just isn't appealing. Next are aesthetics and production at 15 and 10% respectively. I do think that's important. Some people may put this literally at 0 and the beige Euro is all you need in life. You do not care about either of these. But I think if I were to think of my perfect game, I not only want to play it because it intrigues my mind, I want it to intrigue me visually. I want it to pop off the table, and I am a sucker for deluxifications. Now, that's burnt me in the past, as I'm sure it has you, where you go with the deluxified version and it's just not that good. However, there are games like Castles of Burgundy Special Edition that, even though it's this crazy monstrosity, it's worth every penny and inch on my Calic. You play it so much and it's such this wonderful game, and then it's enhanced with all of these wonderful components. I would never trade it in. Then there's replayability. That is super important. It's only at 10%, and it's there because I certainly want to get more plays, especially if I'm buying a game. But there's games that I've played 3 or 4 times that I'm still happy I bought. I'm happy I experienced it, and I don't need to play it a bunch of times. One that falls into that category is Sleeping God Distant Skies. I really enjoyed my time with it. I think it's a great game. If you really want to know what my thoughts are on it completely, go check that video out. I wouldn't want to hurt a game because it's not particularly replayable. And then last for me, and this is probably the most divisive with some of you, it's thematic and thematic implementation. I only have that at 5%. I think it's nice. I think it's nice to have. I think it is something I appreciate, but it's not a deal breaker. I wouldn't want it to have an overly negative impact on any of the games that I'm rating. Just yesterday, I was playing Root with a group, and a guy I was playing with brought up how much he likes that there's these thematic story integrations into all the factions, why they do what they do, connected to all the mechanics. And I thought, you know, that is pretty cool, but I don't care. I really don't care. I think Root, even before I knew that information, I thought Root was a spectacular game. And now that I know it, it's slightly more spectacular because I'm going to raise its thematic ranking. And maybe that's the thing that puts it over. But if none of that existed, I wouldn't want it to drop a full point, for example. And then complexity, player interaction, and skill gap, I put at 0% rank. I still want to rate them, but not from a good to bad, more of an informational output that can be used in a couple other different ways, but just not part of my overall score. So I go through and I start ranking on all of these categories. I input all of the games that have ever been on this channel and I rate them. And I have to say, I'm surprised at a couple different things. First and foremost, I am really surprised that after I took a critical look in all of the categories and I rated these games, not one of them was over 9. If you were to ask me beforehand, I would have bet maybe 3 at least that have been on the channel were rated a 9. But when you critically look at each and every one of those categories and you take things into account like rules overhead, that really hurts games because they don't get to the table, and it makes sense. I'm not mad at how those games came out. I won't go through the list and scores completely. That's another video, possibly. I will go over one that fell in the middle of the ranking. It was Harmonies. I recently did a video on Harmonies. Basically, the premise was that Cascadia was better, and basically left it at that. But when I did the scoring, the aesthetic score on Harmonies put it above Cascadia just barely. And first I wanted to kind of go back and adjust aesthetics to make it align with what my perception was of the game. But when I really thought about it critically and I really looked at all of the different mechanics put together and the enjoyment, and then like my premise that aesthetics is important, it won. So, you know, you might find yourself ranking games differently than your knee-jerk reaction or maybe not so nuanced ratings have been in the past. I certainly found that with some of my rankings. So the one thing that continues to make me super nervous about all of this is those weights. Immediately, I know that some of you out there are going to say putting thematic at 5% is insane. Others will agree. Others will say, I really don't care about theme whatsoever. I saw that in the poll, in fact, that I put out to you. The majority of you value interesting mechanics over thematic implementation. Some of you prefer production over all of that, which is a small sliver, but that goes to show you that the weightings really need to change by person. We're slightly better right now, in my opinion, than a general BGG one number ranking. It's slightly more nuanced, but it's not perfect. I think there's room for improvement here, but it's going to take some engineering. And so I go back to ChatGPT to help me write the rest of this video, and we talk a little bit. I say, oof, that assumes a community will agree, not likely. Bro, I've already ran a few polls and it's clear different people value different aspects quite differently. That's a lot of difference. What if we created a system that matched people based on the weightings of the different aspects? I suppose there might be some personal theme or mechanic preferences that might get lost, but we could take that into account in some form. What do you think? So ChatGPT helps to set up that system and gives me 6 steps. First of which is to poll and gather individual preferences. So all of those weightings, we have to gather them. We would also be asking for preferences in themes and mechanics. That may be helpful in one of the next steps. In step 2, we would categorize our participants. We would then use that information to develop different profiles. Those profiles would then be used to group you with like-minded gamers. People like you that have a similar value system. In step 4, you ask people to go rank their games using all of these different categories. And imagine a world in which your top 100 you're looking at is not based upon what everyone thinks. It's based upon your cohort. It's based upon the grouping of people that you have the most commonalities with possible. And now you're looking at a top 100 of this group's aggregated games. Imagine a world where your cohort has its own discussion group. Think of it as a book club of sorts. Imagine a world where you get personal recommendations based upon how you weighted and rated games. Imagine a world in which you get personal recommendations based upon how your friends in this particular community are rating games. Imagine when one of them puts in a new rating and it pops up in your cohort and you can all discuss it and you all have the same common language around how you rate board games. Gone are the days of someone coming up and saying your idea is stupid, or this game absolutely sucks. What are you talking about? There's so much noise and static out there when we talk about whether we like a board game or not. We have no idea about that person's past or what they like or their favorite game. There's so many things that we're making assumptions on. So of course, to you, I might be an idiot for liking deluxified components. But for me, I just like them. So shut up. And guess what? Everyone in my cohort does as well. So I'm gonna go talk to them about my new deluxified copy of Everdell. A couple other suggestions that ChatGPT had is something that I was already really thinking about, is this idea of dynamic adjustments. And that's where a user is prompted to go re-rank games. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten through 3 plays of a game and it is just firing on all cylinders. Flow state is at a maximum, but after time, it just becomes boring. So your perspective on that game is going to change. Lost Ruins of Arnak probably would have been a 10 out of 10 the moment I played it. I was pretty new to board games in general and didn't understand nor have context on so many other games, and it hadn't become boring yet. And since then it has. Side note, they've released the Expedition Leaders, and I think it makes that game way, way better. But regardless, if I were ranking within my cohort, I'd want to go update that ranking. At the very least, update my perspective on replayability. And the weightings probably need to change over time. As I started the hobby, what I liked or valued then is so much different than now. Thinking of all this, I would love to be connected with people that have common interest and we can discuss things we like, and maybe I can learn from them and find new stuff I like. I have an example of that that's recently happened on this channel only because I have the channel and I put myself out there and people start to give me suggestions. Shout out Kirby Ma, you mentioned Trick Takers, Schadenfreude, I don't know how to say it, and Portland Game Collective. That sent me down an insane rabbit hole around trick taking. And now I've got tons and tons of trick-taking games. Thanks a lot, Kirby. You owe me some money. But it had me start to look at all these different things that, wow, I didn't even realize that there was such a deep niche in trick-taking games. Then shout out Lisa, you mentioned Portland Game Collective's Discord and told me that I need to get on it. I did. You also told me to go to CloudCap Games, which I did. I loved. It's this brilliant little board game store in Portland that cost me a lot of money because they stocked these rare Japanese trick-taking card games. Lisa also mentioned that there's a Portland Game Collective con coming up, and being the introvert I am, I would typically not even think about going to something like that. But I'm really thinking hard about doing it because I kind of fell into this wonderful rabbit hole of this gaming genre. Now, I know, like Portland Game Collective's Discord, these niche communities do exist. One of the things that I found on a lot of these niche communities, I've tried to enter many of them, Root being another one, Too Many Bones, a lot of these other things. They are highly populated, noisy areas that are hyper niche to a really specific type of game or even specific game in and of itself. I get lost in them. I find a hard time making connections. I don't know who to make connections with. It just has to kind of happen. I would imagine if I took a survey and then was put into a smaller group or cohort with people that I know I have a bunch in common with, that would help me to find probably friends first and foremost, but also adjacent games that aren't directly related to the things I already love. I think after walking through all of this, I've realized a simple 1 to 10 rating is silly. It lacks nuance. It lacks context. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't tell me what I need to know. I think a more nuanced version by weighting different categories and having people think critically about each and every category might lead to better, more nuanced scores. And when I started research for this video, I never thought the answer might be community. But the more I think about it, board games are about community. Board games are about coming together and enjoying something together. I really love talking about them, hence this channel. And really, I think in the end, the solution is community. and just being connected to the right people that might just expose you to something adjacent that you would have never known about. Just like me and trick taking and maybe going to a trick taking convention. I don't know. Don't hold me to that. I'm still pretty introverted. I might not show up, but it sounds fun. And if you know of a community out there like that, let me know. I'm going to join it. If it doesn't exist yet, maybe we should build it. And I would love to hear from you, not just from the community perspective, but I touched on so much stuff here. The categories, the weightings, how you would go about this yourself. What am I missing? This is not my dissertation on board games ratings. This is the seed. This is the beginning of how I probably look at rating board games slightly differently. Maybe it'll catch on. Who the heck knows? I would love to continue to refine this idea in the comments with you. So if you made it this far, I appreciate it. Have a great week.